There is a woman you have probably met. Maybe she was someone you loved. Maybe she was someone who raised you. Maybe, if you are honest with yourself, she is you. She carries herself with a quietness that most people mistake for peace. She remembers birthdays. She checks in on people who never check in on her. She listens for hours and asks for nothing in return. She gives advice with a gentleness that makes you feel understood in a way most people spend their whole lives searching for. From the outside, she looks like the most grounded person in the room. But if you ever sat with her long enough in a quiet moment, when she finally let her guard down, you would see something underneath all of that giving. A tiredness so deep it doesn't even feel like tiredness anymore. It feels like weather. It feels like the permanent condition of being her. This is the empathic woman, before the shift. And this video is about what happens to her next. Not what happens if she reads the right book. Not what happens if she finds the right therapist or starts meditating or finally takes that solo trip she has been putting off for 3 years. What happens when none of that is enough anymore? What happens when the weight of absorbing everyone else's emotional world finally reaches its absolute limit? What happens in the moment when something inside her that had always bent decides completely without warning that it will never bend again? That moment has a name, and the woman who survives it has a name too. Throughout history, across cultures that never spoke the same language and never shared the same mythology, a particular kind of woman appeared in the stories people told. She lived at the edge of things, at the border of the village and the forest, at the place where the known world ended and something older began. She was called different things, depending on where and when you found her, but she was always recognizable, always the same woman underneath the different names. Always the woman who had passed through something most people could not survive and come out the other side. Not broken, not bitter, but clear. Terrifyingly, permanently clear. They called her a witch, and the reason they were afraid of her was not what she knew, it was what she could see. Carl Jung spent decades studying the psychological patterns that appear across human civilizations. He found that certain figures, certain types of human beings, appear in the myths and stories of every culture on Earth. He called these archetypes, templates, blueprints of psychological experience so universal they seem to be woven into the structure of the human mind itself. And among all the archetypes he documented, one of the most misunderstood and one of the most powerful was this one. The wise woman, the one who had descended into the darkest version of her own life, survived the descent, and returned not with armor, but with vision. Modern psychology has a sanitized vocabulary for what Jung was pointing at. We talk about post-traumatic growth, we talk about resilience, we talk about emotional intelligence, and all of those terms are true as far as they go, but they don't go far enough. They describe the outcome without describing the fire that produced it. They give you the butterfly without letting you sit with what it actually costs to dissolve everything you were inside a cocoon you didn't choose to enter. Because here's what no one tells empathic women, and what this video is going to tell you directly. The transformation that changes you is not gentle. It is not a slow and graceful unfolding. It does not arrive while you are doing yoga or writing in a gratitude journal or having a breakthrough conversation with someone who loves you. It arrives in the worst moment. It arrives after the last straw. It arrives in the specific, irreversible second when you realize that you have been confusing love with the compulsive need to be needed. That you have been confusing depth of feeling with the obligation to fix everyone who walks through your emotional door. That the exhaustion you have been carrying for so long you think it is just your personality was never yours to carry at all. That second is the beginning of something so significant that across every mythology on Earth, it was described not as a healing, but as a death. Not the death of the woman, the death of the version of her that the world had trained her to be. And what rises after that death is what people for centuries could not explain and therefore feared. What rises? The witch. Now, before you allow the word to sit wrong with you, before the cultural residue of fairy tales and Halloween costumes and centuries of deliberate misrepresentation pulls you away from what I'm saying, I need you to understand what that word actually meant before it was used as a weapon. Because the women who are called witches in the oldest traditions were not women who had hardened. They were not women who had stopped feeling. They were not cold or cruel or closed off from the world. They were women who had passed through enough pain to burn away everything that wasn't real. Women whose empathy had evolved from a wound into a weapon. Not a weapon used against others, a weapon used in defense of themselves. Her. It is incremental and it is ongoing. And it is ongoing. And it is, if you allow it to be, the most interesting project you will ever undertake. Because you are, it turns out, far more complex and far more remarkable and far more remarkable and far more worth understanding than you were ever given room to discover while you were busy being everything everyone else needed you to be. The women in the old stories who were called witches were not separated from their communities because they were dangerous. They were separated because they were free. Because freedom, genuine freedom, the kind that comes from knowing yourself completely and fearing your own disillusion no longer, has always made people who are not yet free deeply uncomfortable. It shows them what is possible. It shows them the cost of what is possible. And not everyone is ready to pay that cost or to sit with the knowledge that it exists. You are watching this video, which means something in you already knows the cost, already knows that at some level below the part of you that is still negotiating with the idea that the life available on the other side of this transformation is worth what it asks, worth the grief of releasing the old version, worth the disorientation of the period in between, worth the loneliness that sometimes accompanies the early stages of becoming someone your previous relationships were not designed to accommodate, worth it completely and without qualification, worth it because what waits on the other side is not a colder life, it is a truer one. Not a life with fewer relationships, but a life where every relationship that remains is there because it is genuinely chosen, genuinely reciprocal, genuinely capable of holding the full weight of who you actually are without flinching. Not a life without vulnerability, but a life where vulnerability is offered as a gift rather than extracted as a tax. Not a life without love, but a life where love finally includes you. The witch was never the villain of the story. She was the woman the story didn't know how to contain. She was too old for the roles available to her, too clear-eyed for the illusions being maintained, too old to be useful to the people who needed her to remain incomplete. You are not too much. You never were. You were simply in the wrong story. And now at last you are writing in